Late 60s psychedelic rock has always been a super interesting pocket of music history, if you look deep enough into it. But why is that? Well, it's all due to the clashing of two powerful opposing forces, hippie freedom culture and widespread political paranoia. On one side, marijuana and hallucinogenic drugs like LSD were fueling the flower power movement, embedding their way into popular culture through music and film. And on the other side, political paranoia is reaching an all-time high, with serious topics like war, racism, and the true meaning of freedom at the forefront of discussion. This monumental clash birthed groups like The Doors, Steppenwolf, and the Grateful Dead, who dominated the airwaves in the late 60s and early 70s with rebel lyrics that united a country divided. And while some popular names came from other regions, there's no doubt that California, and more specifically San Francisco and LA, were the ultimate foundation for politically charged psych rock at the time. And while there were groups that achieved worldwide fame, they left behind bands within this new experimental genre that had an equally important story and message to spread, but just never got the chance to. Some of these lesser-known groups were either doomed from the start, had music that was too weird or scary, or were just plain too ahead of their time. Well, here's a tale of a group that were all three of these, and probably pushed the boundaries of psychedelic rock a little too far. Enter the West Coast pop art experimental band. The band's story is not one that is well known, but I promise you it's probably one of the weirder ones of the era. Despite failing to achieve anything close to success throughout the band's 5-year-long career, they hold a weird, winding story marked by impressive accomplishments, intense controversy, and to this day, shrouded mystery. Our tale begins on one summer night in 1965. An English rock group called the Yardbirds were working through their first US tour, and it wasn't going so well. For those out of the loop, the Yardbirds were a bit of a reverse supergroup containing members like Jeff Beck, Jimmy Page, and Eric Clapton, all before they embarked on wildly successful music careers. However, the foreign group wasn't actually able to play the TV spots they had booked before flying over, as it didn't have the proper paperwork. They basically needed a work permit which they didn't have, a bit of an oversight. So this young eager band were just sitting around the States waiting for paperwork to clear. But while the group couldn't play on TV or in public venues, they could get away with playing private parties. And here's where a fellow named Bob Markley came in, one of the key founders of the West Coast pop art experimental band. Through a few connections and a few phone calls, Markley was suddenly hosting the Yardbirds in his mansion for a few hundred people. The band's management invited all of the LA In music crowd, including local DJs, music journalists, and other members of the local scene. To say the least, it was quite the party. Here's a photo of the band after the gig in Markley's mansion. After playing in the dark, the crowd apparently threw roses at the band when the lights came on, clearly showing their admiration. This is one of those historic events in music history that you just wish you could have attended. However, Markley experienced something a little different that night. Rather than being fixated on the band's new sound, which would become iconic years later, he was more infatuated with the attention that the band were receiving. He saw the crowd's energetic reaction and loving of praise, and saw an opportunity there, at least according to his later band member Michael Lloyd. To understand this Markley fellow a little better, we need to travel back a little. Born in Oklahoma sometime in the mid-1930s, Markley was adopted by a wealthy oil tycoon who would go on to offer Markley virtually every opportunity one could ask for. We don't know much about this part of his life, other than that Markley would get a university education in law while also playing in some local music groups. His greatest accomplishment was hosting a local music-oriented TV show called Oklahoma Bandstand back in his hometown, as he became somewhat of a local celebrity. And with Markley getting his first taste of fame, he decided to travel out west to Los Angeles during the turn of the 60s to try and become a Hollywood star. And initially, Markley was making a good impression, dropping a number of mildly successful singles on Warner Bros. Records in 1960. He released the singles Will We Meet Again and Summer's Coming On, the second of which would foreshadow some of his offbeat creative talent. Markley also entered the world of film, debuting with a minor role in the 1960 flick Where the Boys Are.
2 hot waters.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
Name it.
Bowl of soup.
In Markley's only scene in the movie, he plays this weird, googly-eyed diner flirt who tries to pick up these two girls. It's an underwhelming debut for sure. However, the role becomes a little more sinister when we learn about Markley's true character, which will unravel later on. Some speculate that this uncredited actor from a 1961 episode of 77 Sunset Strip could also be Markley, but there's no way to confirm it. It does look like him, though. Clearly, Markley didn't show any talent in music or film because none of these brief Hollywood appearances would lead anywhere for him. So by the time of the private party in 1965, Markley was more or less a washed-up wannabe Hollywood star who was living a rich life due to his family's money, but was far from successful. So perhaps seeing a young innovative group like the Yardbirds become the heroes of the night, even though Markley was one who got them the gig, made Markley want to give his music career another shot. And in this moment, he met Sean and Danny Harris as well as Michael Lloyd at his party, who were in their own startup band called The Laughing Wind. Keep in mind, Markley was a little older, him being in his early 30s and these other musicians just hitting their early 20s. He decided that enough was enough and made a deal with the eager group. Markley would manage and finance the band, while the Harris brothers and Michael Lloyd would write the group's music. But there was one catch. Despite having little musical talent and acting as their manager, Markley would play with the band on stage, which, in his eyes, would finally get him the fame that he'd been chasing all this time. And thus, the West Coast Pop Art Experimental Band was born.
Part 1, the West Coast Pop Art Experimental Band.
The group would go on to release some absolutely phenomenal psych rock records that really stand above contemporary work at the time, if you appreciate the band's style. And the group's premise was simple, which you can find described right in the name. The West Coast because the group liked the creative atmosphere of the area, pop art because they admired Andy Warhol's artistic genius, and experimental because they would go on to release some pretty weird yet addictive music. And by the way, Markley was the one who came up with this absurd name and arguably their mission statement. We can confidently say that the group's work fits their name, which, depending on who you ask, either ruined the band's music or is the main reason we're talking about them today. The Harris brothers, alongside other key members like Michael Lloyd and Ron Morgan, were mainly responsible for the group's instrumentation, while Markley contributed off-kilter lyrics and the occasional songwriting credit. Essentially, this dynamic clashes in every song, with beautiful acid rock instrumentation meeting lyrics that were really weird, even for psych rock standards. Check out In the Arena off the group's third album. This opening track proves exactly what we're talking about. You've got phenomenal scene-setting instrumentation from some established musicians with wild, politically charged lyrics laid over top, where Markley talks about peaceful protesters being beaten in some arena-like entertainment match. I think these arrangements are what makes the West Coast Pop Art Experimental Band one of the more notable groups of the era, but if you just think this is all plain weird, I wouldn't blame you. For this track, Markley came into the studio with a megaphone and decided to blurt out his lyrical nonsense over what the rest of the band had arranged instrumentally. And the best part? This odd number opens up the album. So while the Doors were putting hit singles like Break On Through at the start of their albums, the West Coast Pop Art Experimental Band were opening with tracks like In the Arena, which would never have a chance of seeing radio play. It's these oddball moves that make the band so charming, but at the same time, it quickly became obvious that the band weren't operating on the same wavelength. As you can expect, tensions grew pretty quickly. Before the release of Volume 2 in 1967, founding member Michael Lloyd had already left the group, pretty much all due to the tension stemming from Markley's controlling tendencies and poor decisions. Other members had fizzled out or stopped playing live with the band, with Lloyd being replaced by Ron Morgan on guitar. This turmoil was mostly caused by Markley, who was seen as negatively influencing the group's creative output with his weird ideas, as well as wanting to keep the band in LA and not go outside of the region to do bigger tours, for example. Markley was just kind of an oddball, who eventually became known for doing things like suing a cafe for not letting him in because his hair was too long. Yeah, he didn't win that legal battle. But even though he became known for these weird choices and odd lyrics, it's also important to note that he was often referred to as intelligent and good at doing business. This was the main reason he remained part of the project despite causing a lot of turmoil, as his wealth funded the band and his connections scored them some pretty solid opportunities, even getting them on Reprise Records, a subsidiary label of Warner Brothers. This meant that the West Coast Pop Art Experimental Band were label mates with artists like Jimi Hendrix and Frank Sinatra. For whatever you think of Markley's inclusions, his industry connections and wealth may be the only reason anyone actually knows about the group today.
Part 2, the West Coast Pop Art Experimental Band.
And despite the band's oddities, they were making headway in the bustling LA music scene, becoming a fan-favorite band pretty quickly. Their major accomplishment was being one of the first music groups to play with a light show, with a psychedelic oil-based liquid light projection playing behind them on stage. They were also known to have film footage playing behind them synchronized with lights, something no other band was doing at the time. He was apparently pretty impressive, and of course, the state-of-the-art technology was funded with Markley's wealth. The group's second album, Part 1, features an album cover that is meant to emulate the band's oil-based liquid light shows, with some good live snapshots of the band on the back jacket. Sadly, there isn't any recorded video of the West Coast pop art experimental band playing live, but the band members are open about their light show being heavily inspired by Andy Warhol's touring art project, the exploding classic Inevitable, which featured similar light shows. So despite not being the real thing, footage of Warhol's shows is probably the closest we'll get to experiencing what a West Coast pop art experimental band looked like in motion.
Lila, I love you, Lila. You are my heart, my desires. I love you, see. Lila. You are my life. You are
Continuing on this trend, Warhol actually had a lot of influence on the band's image, which can be seen further on the cover for Volume 2 that we saw before. The image on the front is hard to see, but it's a picture of the band members in a silver-coated bathroom. This art installation was crafted by Charlie White, who is known for creating wild art pieces around Los Angeles. You can see a little more about how the silver bathroom was created here in a short film documenting Charlie's work, called Charlie White's 177 Feet. White's silver bathroom does share a resemblance with Warhol's Silver Factory, another art installation of his in New York. So while the West Coast pop art experimental band certainly crafted their own image, a lot of their success can be attributed to Andy Warhol's influence, as their inspired liquid light show was a big hit back then. But all of this stage effort was certainly working, as the group would go on to play alongside bands like Steppenwolf, The Doors, The Mothers of Invention, and The Iron Butterfly, hearing sounds from other groups and honing in on their craft. This would all culminate in 1968 with their fourth, and in my opinion, best record, Volume 3, A Child's Guide to Good and Evil. Have a listen to this promo that would have played on the radio around the album's release. Keep in mind, the visuals were done by me, it's not like the band released a commercial or anything like that, but the audio was a real radio promo.
The West Coast pop art experimental band has just made its third album for Reprise Records. Titled A Child's Guide to Good and Evil, it is a step-by-step lesson songbook for losing your innocence. Here's songs soon to be famous like 18 is Over the Hill, and our drummer always plays in the nude. Here also, the anniversary of World War III. Don't be without this valuable guidebook in case of attack by friends, relatives, or hunchbacks. This could be the album of the year, A Child's Guide to Good and Evil. The West Coast Pop Art Experimental Band on Reprise Records.
Okay, so maybe Volume 3 wasn't the album of the year. Actually, it was far from it. But regardless of its place on the charts, Volume 3 is by far the most phenomenal, weird, underrated albums of the era. The record sports a delightful production with incredible song arrangements, and of course, Markley's weird lyrics. The record is probably the band's weirdest, which in turn makes it their greatest accomplishment, at least to my taste. Tracks like 18 is Over the Hill, In the Country, and Watch Yourself are solid psych rock songs that definitely deserve a bigger audience. And coupled with the weirder, more offbeat songs on the record, Volume 3 is a fine accomplishment that any fan of the band would call one of their best, if not their shining achievement. It just brings home everything I discussed in the intro, and to me, really defines the epitome of late 60s psychedelic rock. That being when a soft, bubblegum pop-like sound meets odd lyrics and psychedelics, all culminating into one soothingly sinister vibe. And allegedly, the band's psychedelic sound was crafted without the inspiration of drugs, as most of the band members were known not to partake in that stuff. If that is the case, it just makes some of the things you hear on the band's albums that much weirder. But despite Volume 3 being a bang-on record, it sadly marks the end of the West Coast pop art experimental band's classic era. The band name did see one more full-length release titled Where's My Daddy, which was a certain flop, even though earlier key members like Michael Lloyd and both Harris brothers would be present on this record. Looking at the album's content, it's very clear that Markley's odd, artistic vision came to full fruition on this release, something which we saw here and there before gradually with each album, but hadn't yet fully surfaced. But an odd pattern starts to appear here. If you try and analyze Markley's lyrics, a lot of his content revolves around underage girls, the coming of age, and general innocence. Heck, the radio promo from before even mentions how one of the band's albums is a step-by-step lesson songbook for losing your innocence. Track titles like 18 is Over the Hill and Delicate Fawn kind of allude to this, but there are some songs where Markley blatantly writes about teenagers approaching the age of consent. Keep in mind, Markley was one responsible for writing the band's lyrics, with the other band members just singing most of them. Take a quick listen to Queen Nymphet off Volume 2.
You're on your own. You have to learn how the world can hurt you. When you're older, we'll have a time. When you're older, there'll be a place for us.
And here's where we come full circle. You have this guy who was adopted at a young age and is presumably an orphan, right? He's older than the crowd he hangs around, being in his mid-30s while playing to young teenage audiences. And he's got some weird song ideas and even weirder lyrics. Looking back, it's quite obvious that fame was Markley's only goal, as he made sure to put himself in the songwriting credits for each and every song, acting like he was the main member of the band. This was all a lie, because to the Harris brothers and other members like Ron Morgan, Markley was no more than the band's manager who awkwardly played the tambourine on stage with them. But regardless, Markley used his fame and band member persona to get younger girls and make his questionable intentions a reality. He was even known around his beachside home for using his St. Bernard dog to help him meet girls on the beach. But given Markley's past, it's not quite clear whether his lyrics were about underage girls or whether he saw himself as a child who needed protection. Like I said, we don't know too much about his past, which could have very well been a troubled one prior to his adoption. So while his intentions were certainly questionable, it's not certain whether he saw himself as a damaged child who was speaking to innocent youth about the world's dangers, or whether he was literally writing about his fantasies. Did Markley see himself as the girl on the front cover, trying to find his true father figure? Or is Markley somehow being open with his sinister fantasies through the band's image? And if you think about it, say Markley was a pedophile, why would he publicize this in song? Wouldn't he keep it a secret? These are all questions that are up for debate, and depending on how you see the full picture, it might change how you feel about the band. But just keep in mind that Markley was never a major driving force of the band's sound, other than with his weird song ideas and odd lyrics, which were half the time too odd to properly decipher. And up until this point, the band really only had a few tracks which were kinda creepy in hindsight, and the rest of the group members wrote the songs and put up with Markley's lyrics simply because he was funding the entire project. These issues would lead to the band's breakup as they fizzled apart in 1969. Markley would go on to release one more album under the name Markley. Funnily enough, this record still consists of the West Coast pop art experimental band's key players. It's pretty much the same band under a different name. But with Markley finally taking over, at least in terms of the name, the record completes his cycle of control. You see, the band's debut album, titled Volume 1, came out shortly after Markley met the Harris brothers and Michael Lloyd at the Yardbirds party. And the record pretty much just contains recordings from The Laughing Wind, so therefore Markley had little control here despite managing the group and pressing the album on his own label, under the name of the West Coast Pop Art Experimental Band. Keep note here that the band's second album is actually called Part 1, which can get a little confusing. We assume they named it this because the group wanted a fresh start from the mostly covers album that was their debut. So going back to the timeline, through the next 3 albums, or the band's classic era, Markley slowly puts himself into the band's recording practices, with more and more ideas and odd lyrics of his coming to fruition. And finally, Where's My Daddy shows Markley's true lyrical and personal intentions, and then with the Markley quote-unquote solo project showing him as officially taking over the band, and funnily enough, ultimately driving them into obscurity. Basically, as Markley slowly gained control, his personality and odd intentions became more clear, presumably as he had more control over the songwriting and lyrics, with the band releasing more and more original work with each album. And by this time, many of the band members are quoted in saying that they were slowly losing interest in the group, despite going on to record a couple more albums. To me, Markley's odd creative vision is tolerable throughout their earlier to mid releases, but their last 2 albums show more about his true character than what he should have probably published. For example, Where's My Daddy features the band's signature track, where Markley says the West Coast Pop Art Experimental Band Part 1 or 2 or whatever album the band is releasing. But this time, the girl on the cover is the one reciting the line on the beginning of a track called Everyone's Innocent Daughter. Have a listen.
Part 4, West Coast Pop Art Experimental Band.
Everyone's innocent daughter. Everyone's innocent daughter. Everyone's innocent daughter. Licking her lollipop fingers.
Yeah, that's the stuff that, now that you know more about who wrote the lyrics, makes you feel kind of uneasy. But this real questionable stuff only starts occurring with this record, as the previous albums do cross into questionable territory at times, but in my opinion, never cross the line like Where's My Daddy does. With members splitting off after the brief Mark Lee solo project, most of them would fade into history, just like the name of their weird project did. Ron Morgan is also known for shortly being part of groups Three Dog Night and the Electric Prunes, but sadly died in 1989 from complications caused by a motorcycle crash. The only real notable member to move on to bigger and better things was Michael Lloyd, who would go on to work on scores for films like Dirty Dancing and also produce music for popular artists like Sean Cassidy and Barry Manilow. He's extremely successful, having been a part of over 100 gold and platinum records, one of which even won a Grammy. But what happened to our story's main character? Well, Mark Lee's story following 1969 is just as mysterious as his life before the West Coast Pop Art Experimental Band. After helping produce a handful of more records, such as J.J. Light's Hey Ya, he would kind of just fade away into existence for about 10 years. Fortunately, one of Mark Lee's letters from the early 80s was archived by a family member who made it public. The letter is kind of a long-winded resume, with Mark Lee citing the greatest achievements of his lifetime, essentially. He writes that he spent the better part of the 70s in the Bahamas studying music theory, or in his words, writing and studying songs from 6 a.m. to 2 p.m., 6 days a week preparing for his return, whatever that means. He also says he went to Detroit for a year to study the best of soul music. So this letter serves as Mark Lee's application to many major labels and production companies in the early 80s, as he claims he can surely write hit songs for the new decade. He's trying to make a comeback, essentially. The letter actually does a decent job of describing Mark Lee's career, which, on paper, looks pretty successful, with him being on Warner Brothers Records with a solo career and quote-unquote successful band. But his wording offers the most insight on Mark Lee's attitude and thinking, where he repeatedly refers to the group in a selfish manner and making wild claims that he directly influenced John Lennon when some artistic coincidences occurred. The letter even quotes him as saying that he's qualified to be president of a major record company. It just goes to show how self-centered and delusional he really was at the time, as if his minor experience in record producing and film granted him the capability of running a record company. Anyways, clearly Mark Lee's resume didn't make it past too many reception desks, as he's not credited for producing or being involved with any music past the early to mid-70s. And what's even weirder is that the other band members attest to a completely different story happening. So Mark Lee wrote that he was in the Bahamas and Detroit studying music, right? Well, according to Sean Harris, around the time that Mark Lee left for the Bahamas, there was a warrant put out for his arrest as he was involved with a few underage girls. Sean lived close to Mark Lee during this time and recalls seeing a group of policemen at Mark Lee's front door one day. It's not quite known what became of this, but a few people who were close to Mark Lee say he went to court and perhaps did some jail time, but we're not quite sure. Regardless, he definitely went on this trip of his in the mid-70s to escape the negative publicity in LA and didn't just go to the Bahamas to study music theory. Michael Lloyd also states that Mark Lee's venture to Detroit didn't go so well either, where he apparently got beaten up by members of a local gang for seeing yet another girl there. So that's more likely how Mark Lee spent the 70s, but if you'd rather believe his letter, go ahead. Mark Lee would apparently call his old band members every now and then to catch up and update them on his situation, which is how we get most of the information on Mark Lee's life post the 70s. Our story picks up a few years later in 1983 when Kim Fowley, another record producer who knew Mark Lee, bumped into him at a music convention at UCLA. According to Fowley, Mark Lee's face was all scarred up, which would prove the story of him being badly beaten up in Detroit several years before. And finally, the last time Fowley saw Mark Lee was in 1988, where he was at his lawyer's and found Mark Lee sitting on the floor propped up against the wall. Mark Lee was shaking and his health had clearly deteriorated. The reason for this was that Mark Lee's adoptive father had apparently died shortly before, so Mark Lee was at the lawyer's office collecting necessary documents. And now Mark Lee would have inherited more of his father's money, making him quite the rich man, despite seemingly going into a state of madness, at least according to Fowley's recollection. It's also important to note that sometime in the mid-70s, Mark Lee discovered that he had a long-lost son from a past relationship. The details of this facet of his life aren't too clear, but we do know that Mark Lee's son then passed away in 1980 shortly after they met, which would have certainly contributed to Mark Lee's mental decline. Finally, Mark Lee's story takes us into the early 90s, where he would often go out on a lake near Las Vegas on his rowing boat. Apparently, one day he got lost out in the water, getting badly dehydrated and delirious. We're not sure how he made it back, but he wound up in the hospital, apparently in a borderline vegetative state. And he was just kept there sedated until he died in 2003. Looking at the timeline, Mark Lee was most likely hospitalized for a few good years before he passed. This is all speculative and based on sporadic phone calls people who knew him would receive, so we have to take this all with a grain of salt. Members of the West Coast Pop Art Experimental Band apparently tried to call the hospital where Mark Lee was being kept, but they couldn't get through to him. His demise was for sure odd, but looking back and studying his life, there are a few other weird inconsistencies that are worth discussion. The first revolves around Mark Lee's apparent film debut. Now that you've seen a lot more of what Markley looks like, it becomes hard to truly decipher whether this diner actor actually is our Bob Markley. If we put pictures of Markley side by side with the actor, they certainly resemble one another, but at least to me, I can't 100% attest that this is the same actor. The diner character's nose looks a little thinner and the ears don't seem to match up that well either. Despite this, there are many newspaper articles from 1960 that clearly cite Markley's appearance in both music and film, specifically mentioning him being in Where the Boys Are. It's a great debate among fans of this band, with some guaranteeing that the actor is the same person, and others swearing it's someone else. Let's just chalk it up to makeup and set lighting for now. But one thing is for certain, if you look at the footage from 77 Sunset Strip, the actor portraying Rusty here does look like him. There are no credits for this role, so we'll never be sure, but for my money, this actor looks a whole lot more like our Bob Markley. Now if you compare the actors from Where the Boys Are and 77 Sunset Strip, they don't look all that alike. Let me know what you think. Another aspect of Markley's life that is weird in hindsight relates to the St. Bernard dogs that the Harris family raised. Sean Harris's own dog, Buppy, was found hanging by his leash from the balcony of where Markley was staying, in a home rented from a woman named Lynn Penny. As the story goes, one day Sean and Lynn went for a walk on the beach and tied Buppy to the railing of Markley's balcony. However, when they returned, the dog was found hanging from the railing from its leash, strangled. The running theory is that the dog somehow fell or jumped off on its own and was left hanging in the air. However, there's a rumor going around that one of Markley's neighbors pushed the dog off in order to send Markley a message. Keep in mind, he was known for cruising the beach with the dog, using Buppy as a way to lure in younger girls. Since his neighbors would see this predatory behavior, it doesn't seem unlikely that one of them would have wanted to send a message to Markley, despite how gruesome that message may have been. This also would have been roughly around the time that Markley got in trouble with the police, so it makes sense. Please take this all with a grain of salt because none of it can be proved, but it's just something to think about. And that's the story of the West Coast Pop Art Experimental Band. There's a few things I'd like to add before closing. Firstly, while the band's story is very much centered around Markley's weird life, I cannot remind you how much effect the other band members like Ron Morgan, the Harris Brothers, and Michael Lloyd had on the band's sound, with them writing all the instrumentation and songs, essentially. And while they don't play as major roles in the band's story as the other names mentioned in this video, I can't leave without mentioning other members like drummer John Ware and guitarist Bob Easel, who were part of the project at various points of its life. And even though the band's story is dictated by Markley's life, the opposite is true for the band's sound, with most arrangements and instrumentation done by other band members, with Markley plopping his weird lyrics on top. Secondly, we can't ignore that Markley's intentions were questionable, and depending on how literally you read some of the band's lyrics, some tracks might make you feel a little uneasy, now that you know the whole story. But personally, I don't let this ruin the project for me, as the West Coast Pop Art Experimental Band was a complete gem in the 60s psych scene, and you shouldn't let a few oddball lyrics about innocence and the coming of age ruin a perfectly good project that was written almost entirely by a great group of people. Also, while I don't condone Markley's behavior, you have to take into account that the 60s were a different time, especially with everything going on in LA and the surrounding area. And from Markley's girlfriends and women who knew him who have told stories about him in the past, it seems like his relationships were consensual, he just chased younger girls. This is my take on it from reading quotes from other band members and also speaking to people who knew Markley, but we'll never be quite sure what exactly went on in Markley's private life. Thirdly, I'd like to thank Tim Forster, who's the unofficial expert of the West Coast Pop Art Experimental Band, but by this time he really should be the official one. He's interviewed most of the surviving members of the group and put together a solid chunk of the info we know about them today, most of which are included in his various write-ups on the band's story. Please check those out if you want to know more about this odd, lovely band. You can also check out this interview he did a while back where he gives a pretty good history of the group. I'll leave the link in the description. I'd also like to thank the West Coast Pop Art Experimental Band Facebook page, which consists of many key people, some of which are related to the band members who have used the site to post unseen photos of the group. Without Tim's journalism and the Facebook group archive, this video would not have been possible. In conclusion, if you haven't heard them, check out some of the West Coast Pop Art Experimental Band's material. You might like what you hear, but you also may be weirded out by how the group expresses their sentiments about war, freedom, and innocence. But I think that's the whole point. Thanks for tuning in.